Hello, my name is June. I am a bass music producer, DJ, sound designer, music educator, and today I wanted to talk to you about templates. Templates are a very important part of my workflow, and I recognize that not everyone is like me. I like things to be very organized, I like everything to be in its place right when I set up, and some people prefer the flexibility of a blank Ableton Live set that allows them to go in 1,000 different directions to a template that may or may not pigeonhole them into a certain writing direction or a certain arrangement direction or mixing direction or anything like that. But they're all wrong and I'm right. So today we're going to talk about why you should be using templates so that you can be just like me. I would also like to remind everyone that I have a Patreon, patreon.com/June_Bernie, where I release monthly sample packs. This month, I released a pack of chord stabs, which was actually really fun. It wasn't something I had done before, but playing with it was really inspiring, and I can't wait to see how these sounds appear in my upcoming tracks. And if you don't feel like supporting monetarily, a like, comment, and a subscribe would be very much appreciated. Okay. So I don't have much of a plan. Let's just hop right into the template and we'll start poking around. So the first thing you may notice is that everything is split up into these 4, arguably 5 basic groups. For going from the top down, we have air, which is like my high-end stuff. Then we have soprano/alto, which is kind of my more high mids. Then I have alto/tenor, which is kind of my low mids. And then I have my D plus B group, which is my drum and bass group. Drum and bass, haha. And then within that group, I have a bass group that is grouped with my drums. Let's start from the bottom up. So let's start with the drums. My drums are kind of in this Frankenstein nested instrument rack, drum rack kind of situation. If I start on the outermost instrument rack, you can see there are 3 chains here. We have the snares chain, the kicks chain, and the side chain triggers chain. Let's start with the actual drum elements. So we'll start with the kicks. I like to give myself the option of using multiple kicks. So I have up to 4 cells here available for kicks. And then all of them are going through my default mixing rack here. This is actually an old version of it, but that's fine. Next, in the snares group, in the snares chain, we have 3 chains within that chain. This is a bit of a holdover from when I used to do more layering in my projects. I don't tend to do that much anymore. I'll tend to just grab a single snare sample and chuck it in there and call it good. But this gives me the option where if I have 3 different snares at like 3 different points in my track, I can layer in other drum elements. So if I have my main snare here and then I decide, oh, it needs a little bit more, I don't know, transient, so we'll like layer in a clap or something there, and then I can process them together. And the same thing on these other chains. The sidechain triggers, all you need to know is that these cells have external instrument devices in them, and they are being routed to the 4 kind of main groups. I guess 3 main groups and then 1 subgroup. So, you know, I have 1 going to my air, 1 going to my soprano, 1 going to my alto, and 1 going to my bass. So we have 4 different sidechain triggers triggering these different groups. Well, I'm using a device that I actually just learned about today, so this is fresh knowledge. This was brought to my attention by Slink, producer, glitch hop producer, does a lot of great Ableton content on YouTube. Check him out. I used to use LFO Tool, the X for Records Steve Duda device. When Ableton 11 first came out, I noticed that there was a device called Shaper, which does this kind of continuous volume automation. And I remember when I first saw this device thinking, God, it would be so cool if it allowed for a MIDI input to trigger this envelope as a single envelope rather than a looping kind of LFO thing, so that I could use it as a sidechain trigger. And apparently Slink had the exact same thought, because he, and I guess a couple friends of his, developed Duck Buddy, which is exactly what I just described. It's the shaper tool with a little MIDI trigger. So we are ducking the volume with the use of a MIDI input. So when I create a MIDI track in this drum rack, you can see everything is already pre-named for me. And down here, these are all the triggers. So when I place a MIDI note here, it's sending that MIDI note to this bass group and triggering Duck Buddy. You can see when I hit the space bar, we get this input flash here. So that is how my drums and my sidechain are being set up. Let's talk a little bit about these main groups again and why I set these up the way I did. So basically there are 5 main groups here: air, soprano / alto, alto / tenor, and then bass and drums, which are grouped together in their own kind of thing. As far as I see it, if you have 5 different elements of a song going at the same time, you've pretty much reached your maximum of things the listener can hear at a single time or keep track of at a single time. I find that anything beyond that, things start to get a bit cluttered in the arrangement, in the orchestration. I guess that's the word I'm looking for. So I've organized it such that the lower elements are lower in these group of tracks and the higher elements are up here. This makes things very, very convenient. I was actually inspired by Bach chorales. I'm actually going to pull up an image here. Yeah, you can see this, where we have 4 voices going at the same time, and they all have their own place. You may have heard of SATB, which stands for soprano, alto, tenor, bass, which is a very common choral arranging kind of framework. So I was very much inspired by that. This actually sets up a cool situation in terms of mixing. In a class I took on electronic music production back in the day, I was having a conversation with my teacher where I was working on a track and I had written all the parts and I showed it to him and he goes, "Oh, this is mixed really well." And I said, I hadn't mixed this at all, really. I had just kind of thrown the parts together. And he said, "Well, one of the great things about mixing is that if your composition and your arrangement and your orchestration is good, then there really isn't much mixing to be done because all of those musical elements are already where they're supposed to be." So that was a big kind of aha moment for me with the interplay of composition, arrangement, orchestration, and mixing kind of coming together. So that was a big inspiration for how I set up this template. Something I forgot to mention in the initial recording, which I am now re-recording, is the effect rack that I have on every single MIDI and audio track. You can see it's just called Default Effects Rack. It's got an EQ, compressor, saturator, a deactivated limiter, and a utility. These tend to be things that will probably get used on every single track, so they're there. If I don't need them, I can delete them. Next, let's talk about these locators. So you may look at this and think, well, not every single track that I write has the exact same structure. Not every single track has, 16 bars of an intro, and then 16 bars of a breakdown, and then 16 bars of a build-up, and then 16 bars of a drop, and then 16 bars of blah, 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 blah. Our arrangement doesn't often go like that. And it's actually very, very rare that I stick to this formatting very precisely. Usually things like the intro will get cut down a bit, so I'll take everything and just move it forward, 8 bars, so that I only have an 8-bar intro rather than a 16-bar intro. Or maybe I want this breakdown section to go on a little bit longer, so I'll drag things out this way. Or maybe I don't even want an intro at all, so we'll just delete that and then start my track here. So there's a lot more flexibility afforded here than it may appear at first glance. This also makes it very easy if I'm working on a particular section, say I'm working on the drop, I can just drag these loop brackets to this one drop section, and then that section will loop over and over again, and I won't have to worry about hitting spacebar constantly. Let's talk a little bit more about this bass drum group. So you can see here that after the drum rack, I have some pretty standard effects. I got a saturator, glue compressor, and limiter. These are just here to take all of these disparate sounds, like your snares and your kicks, and glue them together. We want them to really drive the groove, and we really want them to feel like they're working in congruence rather than just different elements that vaguely gesture at a groove. Then I have a kind of similar setup on the bass. I have a saturator and a glue compressor. Again, just to kind of beef up these sounds. So because the drums and the bass tend to be the most dynamic elements, and usually the loudest elements too, it's really, really important that we control them. You know, we don't need to do hard brick wall limiters on every single sound or anything like that, but we do need to tighten things up a bit. So these drums are being saturated and compressed and limited. The bass is being, compressed and saturated, and then both of them are going into another glue compressor and saturator. And I'm not pushing these effects. I'm not doing like really aggressive compressing. I'm not doing really aggressive saturating. It's just there to get everything kind of packed together. Another thing a music teacher said to me that has really stuck with me throughout my years as a producer and a composer is that the bass line is married to the kick drum. That doesn't mean that, every single time a kick is hitting that you have a bass note, or that they're doing the exact same things constantly. But the bass should reinforce the drums, and the drums should reinforce the bass. They are the rhythm section, after all. If you think about a kind of typical, rock, pop, jazz, funk ensemble, the bass player and the drummer, and sometimes like the rhythm guitarist or the keyboard player, are collectively regarded as the rhythm section. And a rhythm section, when we're talking about like actual musicians, they really need to be in sync. I almost like to think of a rhythm section as one big instrument. And in aggressive genres like drum and bass or dubstep or anything like that, that can really go a long way. Let's talk a little bit about the sends I have here. So I only have two sends. I have a small reverb, and I have a big reverb. That's basically it. I use the same reverbs on every single track I ever made, basically. These ones are relatively new because I've switched up my template recently. But I've never once had someone come up to me and be like, hey, your reverbs are sounding very similar. What's going on there, June? Like, no one cares. These reverbs are only really there to give a little bit of space. On the snare, I'll sometimes use this small reverb just to put it in a place. And then things like really aggressive leads or crashes, I'll put the big reverb on to kind of wash things out. These are just there to give really subtle touches. They're not there to be, this long dramatic reverb tail that you freeze in reverse and leads into something else. It's just there so that the musical elements don't sound like they're directly against your ear. Now let's talk about what's on the master track. So I have two spectrum analyzers and a kind of crappy mastering chain. This isn't something I actually use for mastering. It's usually something I use just to preview a master before I send it off to an actual mastering engineer. I don't do my own mastering. I don't recommend that people do their own mastering, but that's a subject for another video. These two spectrums are configured in very different ways. The first one I'll talk about in a minute. This spectrum analyzer is just here to give you a broad sense of how the mix is balanced, making sure your highs aren't too high, making sure your lows aren't too low, blah, 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 blah. It's basically all of the same default settings that you would be familiar with if you drag the spectrum analyzer onto a track. This, on the other hand, is configured in such a way that I learned about through Mr. Bill. And again, if you're watching this channel, you probably know who Mr. Bill is. If not, go check out his channel. He doesn't need my hype. He's Mr. Bill. But he sets up this to be a means of monitoring the low end, and I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. In my bass group, I have an operator here by default. I don't use this for all my subs. I will sometimes, but it's just there so that I have a quick device to write some sub parts if I need them quickly. So you can see I just have a standard sine wave. I'm going to bring it down to sub territory there. If you're not wearing headphones or you don't have a subwoofer, you may not be able to hear that. You can see when I play that sub, it is right at -12, which is actually exactly where I want it. And I balance the rest of my mix around that. Again, that's a conversation for a mixing tutorial. This is kind of just about my general template. So we'll talk about that another time. That is basically it. There are a few things I haven't talked about yet. For example, the names that I give these tracks. This is something that I think is more up to the individual producer, composer, because I know the kind of things that I tend to like in a track. You are probably more familiar with things that you like in your tracks. But if I have a main melody, usually it's something like a synth. I don't tend to record vocals all that often. But if it was a vocal, I'd probably put it in one of these tracks. I'd probably put it in soprano 1 or alto 2. If I have a lead synth or a vocal or something like that, that will usually go in alto 1. Or if it's particularly high, it might go in soprano 1. And then I also have things like risers and downshifters, effects, style sounds. And generally speaking, I'm just thinking about everything here as being in the high mids, and then things down here are more on the low mids. If I do have a lead melody that is more on the low mids, then I'll put that here and I'll mix it higher. So this does afford me a lot of flexibility. You can see in the air, I have a drum rack here for percussion. And again, my default effects. Another drum rack here for crashes. I like to have those in different drum racks. And then I also have 2 audio tracks here for like textures or atmospheres. So I might put some room tone here, or some like reverb tails and stuff like that, just to sounds that are meant to give the track some texture. Now that's just about everything. I'm not going to make this available on my Patreon or anything like that, because I think a template should be personal. For example, if you're a person who records a lot of vocals, I think it would be a really great idea to have a track or a group of tracks dedicated to vocals and vocal processing. So maybe you have a string of effects on that vocal track that suit your vocal style, or suit the amount of compression that you want on your vocals, or the amount of reverb, or blah, 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 blah. And that's really the takeaway I want you to have from this, is make a template, but make it yours. And you could do something like Tom Cosm does in the DJ Megaset series of templates that he's put out, where he's got hundreds of tracks and hundreds of audio effects all going at once, and they're all routed in exactly the way he wants. And it's all very, very specific. I've seen people with very minimal template setups, with maybe just like a piano and a acoustic drum kit in there, so they can quickly sketch out ideas and then build around it. I think that's a great way to approach a template. If you're one of those people who likes the freedom and the flexibility of a blank template, like I described earlier, there is a middle ground there. You don't need to go as detailed as I did. You can even go more detailed than I did. There's a whole spectrum there, right? So I hope you found this helpful. Comment, like, subscribe, do all those things. They're all really important. They help out the channel or whatever. Also, if you would like to support me in a more direct way, I have a Patreon. And once a month, I release sample packs, and you can get all of the sample packs I've ever made for the past, 2-3 years for just $1 a month. So please consider supporting, please consider subscribing. Hope you have a good day.
Yeah. Catch me at my darkest, feeling a spark to start shit. It's bloodstained fingers on a pen, feeling marvelous. But people already shown what is sown when you dig deep. 6 feet, if you can run away, grab some big cleats and fly, kid. Cause I'm designed to find dine shit with the timeless fangs. As a creature I bang